The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of Riverside County Courthouse as Diana Thompson stepped out of her black sedan. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that comes from years of fighting battles, in courtrooms and government halls. Today was different, though. Today, she wasn't here as the state attorney general making an official visit. She was here to see something most people in her position never get to witness: how the justice system really worked when no one important was watching. Diana had been in the job for only 3 months, but already she'd heard too many stories. Phone calls from worried mothers, letters from community leaders, reports that made her stomach turn, all saying the same thing: that some courthouses treated people differently based on the color of their skin. She could have sent investigators. She could have demanded reports. But Diana believed in seeing things with her own eyes. She dressed down for the occasion. No designer suit today. Just a simple navy blue outfit from a department store, the kind any working woman might wear to court. Her hair was pulled back, in a basic ponytail. No jewelry except small earrings. She wanted to blend in, to be invisible, to see what really happened when the cameras weren't rolling and the politicians weren't watching. The courthouse lobby buzzed with morning activity. Lawyers wheeled in cases on rolling carts, families huddled together on benches, whispering nervously about their court dates. Security guards checked bags and waved metal detector wands. Diana joined the line like everyone else, showing her basic state ID. Not the one that identified her as Attorney General, but the regular driver's license she kept for moments like this. The security guard barely glanced at her as she passed through the metal detector. Good. That meant her disguise was working. Diana made her way to the 3rd floor where Judge Martinez held his morning session. She'd chosen this courtroom specifically after reviewing complaint records. 3 formal complaints in the past year, all from minority defendants or their families, all claiming unfair treatment by court staff, all quietly dismissed or buried in paperwork. She slipped into the back row of the public seating area, pulling out a small notebook disguised as a personal planner. To anyone watching, she looked like just another person dealing with court business, maybe waiting for a hearing, maybe supporting a family member. The courtroom itself was impressive in that old-fashioned way courthouses were built to be impressive. High ceilings, dark wood everywhere. The judge's bench elevated like a throne, the American flag drooping in the still air. Everything designed to make regular people feel small and powerless. Judge Martinez entered right on time at 9 o'clock. He was a thin man in his 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He moved with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd been doing the same job for 20 years. "All rise," called the bailiff, and everyone stood. The bailiff. Diana studied him carefully as he went through the morning routine. Officer Derek Hutchins, according to the nameplate on his uniform. Mid-40s, built like an ex-football player who'd been spending too many years behind a desk, but still thought he was intimidating. 15 years on the job, according to the file she'd reviewed before coming. No major disciplinary actions on record, but that didn't mean much. A lot of bad behavior never made it into official files. She watched how Hutchins interacted with people as the morning session began. When a well-dressed white attorney approached the bailiff's station to ask a question, Hutchins smiled and spoke quietly, helpfully. When a young Latino man in work clothes asked where he was supposed to sit for his hearing, Hutchins barely looked up and pointed with his chin toward the back benches. Small things. The kind of things most people wouldn't even notice. But Diana had trained herself to see patterns. The way Hutchins' whole body language changed depending on who was talking to him. The way his voice got sharper with some people and softer with others. The morning cases were routine stuff. Traffic violations, small claims disputes, domestic issues. Diana took careful notes, not about the cases themselves, but about everything happening around them. How long different people had to wait before being heard. Whether they got clear explanations of what was happening. Whether they were treated with basic respect. She noticed that when Mrs. Chen, an elderly Chinese woman, stood to speak about her son's case, she had to repeat herself 3 times before Hutchins told her to speak louder. But when Mr. Davidson, A middle-aged white businessman spoke just as quietly about his parking ticket. Hutchins leaned forward attentively and even asked clarifying questions to help him out. During a brief break between cases, Diana stood up and stretched her legs. She walked slowly around the public area, still playing her role as just another courthouse visitor. She examined the notices posted on the bulletin board. Information about legal aid services, court schedules, public announcements. All standard stuff, but she noticed most of it was only in English despite the fact that this county had a large Spanish-speaking population. "Ma'am, you need to stay in the seating area during active session," a voice said behind her. Diana turned to find Hutchins standing there. Up close, she could see the small details that told a story. The way his uniform was pressed just so, the shine on his badge, the carefully maintained appearance of authority, but also the coldness in his eyes when he looked at her. "Of course, officer," Diana said politely. "I was just looking at the public notices." "Court's back in session," Hutchins said, though Judge Martinez hadn't returned yet. "Take your seat." There was something in his tone, not just official authority, but something sharper. Diana filed it away in her mental notes and returned to her bench. The morning session continued. More cases, more observations. Diana watched, a young black mother trying to navigate a complicated custody hearing without an attorney. She watched Hutchins roll his eyes when the woman asked for clarification about a form she needed to fill out. She watched the woman's frustration and confusion as she struggled to understand legal language that might as well have been a foreign tongue. When a similar situation came up with a white father asking about paperwork, Hutchins took the time to explain things step by step. He even walked over to show the man exactly where to sign and date the forms. Same courthouse, same bailiff, same types of forms, completely different treatment. Diana's pen moved steadily across her notebook pages. She wasn't just documenting incidents now. She was seeing the whole system in action. The way it worked smoothly for some people and created barriers for others. The way power dynamics played out in 100 small interactions that most people never thought about. During the noon recess, she stayed behind as the courtroom emptied out. This was when she'd planned to identify herself to Judge Martinez and discuss what she'd observed. But the judge had already left for his chambers, and she found herself alone in the courtroom, except for Hutchins, who was organizing papers at his station. She pulled out her briefcase, the real one, with her official documents and identification. Time to drop the disguise and have some serious conversations about what she'd witnessed this morning. But first, she wanted to review her notes one more time. She moved to a quieter area near the judge's bench, where she could spread out her papers and organize her thoughts. She had a lot to discuss with Judge Martinez about training programs and policy changes, and making sure every person who walked into this courtroom was treated with basic human dignity. Diana had no way of knowing that her morning of quiet observation was about to become something very different. She had no idea that Hutchins had been watching her just as carefully as she'd been watching him. And she definitely didn't know that her decision to move to that particular spot in the courtroom was about to set off a chain of events that would change everything. She opened her briefcase and pulled out her files, completely focused on the notes she'd taken and the patterns she'd observed. The courtroom was quiet now, peaceful even. Just her and Hutchins and the weight of everything she'd seen that morning. Diana Thompson, the highest law enforcement official in the state, sat in that empty courtroom planning how to make things better. She had no idea she was about to become the center of exactly the kind of incident she'd come here to investigate. Diana was deep in her notes when she heard footsteps approaching. Heavy, deliberate steps that echoed in the nearly empty courtroom. She looked up to see Officer Hutchins walking toward her, his face set in a stern expression that she'd seen him use with other people throughout the morning. "Ma'am." His voice cut through the quiet air like a blade. "You can't be in that area." Diana glanced around, confused. She was standing near the front of the courtroom, but not in any restricted zone. The judge's chambers were behind closed doors. The jury box was clearly marked off. She was simply in an open area where she'd seen lawyers and court staff move freely all morning. "I'm sorry," she said. keeping her voice calm and professional. "I thought this area was open to the public during recess." "It's not," Hutchins said flatly. He moved closer, and Diana could see something in his eyes that made her uncomfortable. Not just authority, but something uglier. "Public seating is back there." He pointed toward the benches she'd been sitting on earlier. Diana had dealt with difficult people her entire career. As a prosecutor, as a judge, and now as Attorney General, she'd learned how to read situations and people. What she was seeing in Hutchins' face wasn't just a bailiff doing his job. This was something personal. "I understand," she said, closing her briefcase. "I was just reviewing some documents, but I can certainly move back to the public area." "Documents?" Hutchins' voice sharpened. "What kind of documents?" The question caught Diana off guard. In all her years in courtrooms, she'd never had a bailiff question what papers she was carrying. People brought all kinds of paperwork to court: case files, evidence, personal records, legal forms. It was completely normal. "Just some notes from this morning's session," she said, which was technically true. Nothing that would concern court security. But Hutchins wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed to be getting more aggressive. "I need to see them." Now Diana was truly confused. Bailiffs didn't have authority to search people's personal papers without cause. They weren't police officers making arrests. They were court security, meant to keep order and handle disruptions. A woman quietly reviewing her own notes hardly counted as a security threat. "Officer," she said, trying to keep things professional, "I don't think that's necessary. I'm happy to move to the public seating area, but my personal papers aren't subject to search without probable cause." The mention of probable cause seemed to set something off in Hutchins. His face darkened and he stepped even closer to her. Too close. Uncomfortably close. "Don't quote law at me," he said, his voice low but aggressive. "I've been doing this job longer than you've probably been alive." That was definitely not true. Diana was 38 and had been working in the justice system for over 15 years. But she didn't bother correcting him. What worried her more was the change in his whole demeanor. This wasn't about court security anymore. This was personal, and she was starting to understand why. She'd watched him all morning, seen how he treated different people differently, how his attitude changed based on who he was talking to, and now she was experiencing it firsthand. "Am I not trying to cause any problems?" Diana said, taking a small step back. "I'll move wherever you'd like me to move." "You people always say that," Hutchins muttered, and there it was. The thing that had been lurking under the surface all morning, finally out in the open. "You people." Diana felt her stomach drop. In those 2 words, she heard everything she'd suspected about this courthouse, about Hutchins, about the complaints that had brought her here in the first place. She'd heard those words before too many times, and they never meant anything good. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "What do you mean by, you people?" Hutchins realized what he'd said, and for a moment she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But instead of backing down or apologizing, he doubled down. "You know exactly what I mean," he said. "Coming in here thinking you can go wherever you want, do whatever you want, acting like the rules don't apply to you." Diana's mind was racing. She could pull out her official identification right now and end this entire confrontation. One look at her Attorney General credentials and Hutchins would probably stumble over himself apologizing. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the investigator in her, wanting to see how far this would go. Maybe it was the part of her that knew this exact scene played out regularly with other people who didn't have powerful positions to protect them. "Officer Hutchins," she said, reading his nameplate. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not trying to break any rules or cause any trouble. I'm simply here on legitimate business." "Legitimate business?" Hutchins laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Let me guess. Baby daddy didn't pay child support? Got arrested for shoplifting? Or maybe you're here because your son got caught dealing drugs?" Each assumption hit Diana like a physical blow, not because they would be shameful if true, but because of what they revealed about how this man saw her. He'd looked at her, a professional woman in business attire, carrying a briefcase, conducting herself with dignity, and immediately assumed She was there because of some stereotype he carried in his head. No, Diana said quietly. None of those things. Then what? Hutchins demanded. What's your legitimate business that requires you to be going through documents in restricted areas? This isn't a restricted area, Diana pointed out, which was absolutely true. She'd checked the courthouse layout before coming. She'd studied the public access rules. She knew exactly what areas were off limits and what areas weren't. But Hutchins wasn't interested in facts anymore. It is if I say it is, he declared. I'm court security. I decide what's restricted and what's not. That wasn't how court security worked, and Diana knew it. Bailiffs had specific duties and specific authority. They couldn't just make up rules on the spot because they didn't like someone. But she also knew that arguing the point would only escalate things further. All right, she said. I'll gather my things and move back to the public seating. She started to close her briefcase, but Hutchins wasn't done. Not so fast, he said. I still haven't seen what's in those papers. Diana looked up at him. Officer, you don't have legal authority to search my personal documents without cause. I have cause, Hutchins said. Suspicious behavior in a restricted area. What suspicious behavior? Diana asked. I was reading my own notes. That's what you say, Hutchins replied. But I saw you watching people all morning, taking notes about everything, writing down names. That sounds like surveillance to me. Diana's heart sank. He had been watching her. All morning while she'd been observing the courtroom dynamics, he'd been observing her. And now he was twisting her legitimate oversight activities into something suspicious. I can explain everything, she said, reaching for her official identification. If you'll just let me show you my credentials. Keep your hands where I can see them, Hutchins barked, suddenly acting as if she posed some kind of threat. Other people in the courthouse were starting to notice the commotion. A few lawyers who'd returned early from lunch break stopped to watch. The court clerk, Janet Morrison, poked her head out of her office to see what was happening. Diana realized the situation was spiraling completely out of control. What had started as a routine oversight visit had turned into a public confrontation based on racial profiling and abuse of authority. And the worst part was, she knew this wasn't unusual. She knew that countless other people had probably stood in this same spot, facing this same bailiff, experiencing this same treatment, without any way to fight back. The only difference was that Diana Thompson had the power to fight back. The question was whether she should use that power now, or let this play out to see exactly how bad it could get. Looking at Hutchins' face, seeing the anger and prejudice written there so clearly, she was starting to think she was about to find out. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Diana could feel eyes on them from all directions, lawyers, court staff, and a few members of the public who'd returned early from the lunch break. Everyone seemed to sense that something serious was happening, but no one quite knew what to do about it. Diana kept her hands visible and spoke as calmly as she could. Officer Hutchins, I think we can resolve this very easily. I have identification that will clear up any confusion about why I'm here. She reached slowly toward her briefcase, moving deliberately so he could see exactly what she was doing. Her official credentials were in a leather wallet in the front pocket, the ones that identified her as the state attorney general. All she had to do was show them to him, and this whole nightmare would be over. But as her hand moved toward the briefcase, Hutchins stepped forward aggressively. I said, keep your hands where I can see them, he shouted. I'm just reaching for my identification, Diana said, trying to stay calm even as her heart started racing. You asked to see my papers. I didn't ask you to reach for anything, Hutchins snapped. Step away from the briefcase. Diana stared at him in disbelief. This was beyond any reasonable interpretation of court security protocols. He was treating her like she was some kind of dangerous criminal, when all she'd done was sit in a public courtroom and take notes. Officer, please, she said. Let me show you my credentials and we can end this misunderstanding right now. The only misunderstanding, Hutchins said, his voice rising, is you thinking you can come into my courtroom and do whatever you want. His courtroom. Not Judge Martinez's courtroom, not the people's courtroom. His courtroom. The possessiveness in his voice told Diana everything she needed to know about how he viewed his authority. Janet Morrison, the court clerk, had come out of her office completely now. She stood near the back of the courtroom, watching the confrontation, with obvious concern. Diana caught her eye for a moment, hoping the woman might intervene, but Janet just stood there looking nervous. "Ma'am," Diana called to her, "could you please ask Officer Hutchins to allow me to show my identification? I think that would clear up this entire situation." But before Janet could respond, Hutchins whirled around to face Diana again. "Don't. You involve other people in this," he said angrily. "You're trying to cause a scene. That's what you people do, isn't it? Cause scenes and then claim you're victims when someone tries to maintain order." There it was again. "You people." But this time he said it louder, in front of witnesses. Diana saw Janet's face change as she heard it. She saw one of the lawyers near the back of the courtroom shake his head in disgust. "Officer," Diana said, her voice still steady but with steel underneath it, "I need you to step back and allow me to retrieve my identification. I have every right to show you my credentials." "You have the right to follow my instructions," Hutchins replied, "and I'm instructing you to step away from that briefcase and move to the back of the courtroom where you belong. Where you belong." The words hung in the air like poison. Diana felt something shift inside her. She'd spent her entire career fighting against exactly this kind of treatment. She'd prosecuted cases where people had been mistreated by those in authority. She'd worked to reform systems that allowed this kind of abuse to happen, and now she was experiencing it herself. "I'm not moving anywhere," she said quietly, "until I'm allowed to show you who I am." Hutchins' face turned red. "You're not allowed to do anything except what I tell you to do." He started walking toward her, and Diana could see from his body language that the situation was about to get physical. Everything about his posture, his clenched fists, his aggressive stride, told her he was done talking and ready to use force. "Officer Hutchins," she said, raising her voice so everyone in the courtroom could hear clearly, "I am asking you to allow me to identify myself properly. I am not resisting. I am not being disruptive. I am simply requesting to show you my official identification." "Too late for that," Hutchins growled as he reached her. He grabbed her arm roughly, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave marks. Diana gasped at the sudden pain and the shock of being physically assaulted by a law enforcement officer. "You're under arrest for trespassing and disorderly conduct," he announced, though Diana knew perfectly well she'd done neither. "Officer, you're making a serious mistake," she said, trying to pull her arm free from his grip. "Please look at my identification before you do something you'll regret." But Hutchins was beyond listening to reason now. Whatever had been building up in him all morning, maybe all his career, was coming out now. He seemed to see her not as an individual person, but as a symbol of everything he resented and feared. "The only mistake," he said, twisting her arm as he spoke, "was letting you people think you can come in here and disrespect this court." Diana tried to maintain her balance as he pulled her toward the judge's bench, apparently planning to handcuff her there. But his grip was too tight and his movements too sudden. When she tried to adjust her footing, he interpreted it as resistance. "Stop resisting," he yelled, though she was doing nothing of the kind. What happened next felt like slow motion to Diana. Hutchins, apparently thinking she was trying to pull away from him, yanked her arm hard and pushed her toward the judge's bench. The combined force of the pull and push sent her stumbling forward, unable to catch her balance. She hit the wooden bench with enough force to knock the wind out of her. Her briefcase, which she'd been carrying in her other hand, flew open as she tried to use it to break her fall. Papers scattered everywhere, her notes from the morning, official documents with state seals, correspondence with her office, and, most importantly, her identification wallet that clearly showed her position as State Attorney General. The sound of her hitting the bench echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Diana found herself on the floor, her professional clothes disheveled, her dignity shattered, surrounded by official documents that told the true story of who she was. For a moment, there was complete silence in the courtroom. Even Hutchins seemed stunned by what had just happened. He stood over her, breathing hard, his face flushed with anger and adrenaline. Diana pulled herself up slowly, checking for injuries. Her shoulder ached where she'd hit the bench. Her arm throbbed where Hutchins had grabbed her. But more than the physical pain was the emotional impact of what had just happened. She'd been assaulted by a law enforcement officer for no reason other than the color of her skin and his assumptions about who she was. As she knelt on the floor, gathering her scattered papers, she saw something that made her heart sink even further. Blood on one of the documents. She touched her lip and realized it was bleeding from where she'd hit the bench. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Janet Morrison had finally found her voice and was hurrying over to help. "Stay back," Hutchins ordered the clerk. She was resisting arrest. But Janet wasn't looking at Hutchins. She was looking at the papers scattered on the floor, and her face had gone completely white. Diana followed Janet's gaze and saw what the clerk was staring at. Her official identification wallet had fallen open, displaying her credentials clearly. The gold seal of the state attorney general's office glinted in the courthouse lights. Janet Morrison's hands flew to her mouth as she read the name and title on the identification card. Diana Thompson, Attorney General, State of California. "Oh my God," Janet whispered. And that's when Diana heard footsteps coming from the judge's chambers. Heavy official footsteps that meant Judge Martinez was returning from his lunch break. The whole situation was about to get much more complicated. The footsteps from Judge Martinez's chambers grew louder as Diana slowly got to her feet, still gathering her scattered papers from the floor. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of what had just happened and the anger she was trying very hard to control. Officer Hutchins stood frozen, staring down at the documents spread across the courtroom floor. His face had changed from red flushed anger to something else entirely. Confusion, maybe. The beginning of doubt. But he wasn't close enough to read the papers clearly, and his pride was keeping him from admitting he might have made a mistake. "Everyone needs to calm down," he announced to the courtroom, as if he hadn't been the one creating all the chaos. "This situation is under control." But Janet Morrison was still staring at Diana's identification wallet, her face getting whiter by the second. The clerk knew exactly what she was looking at, and the implications were hitting her like a freight. "Train, Officer Hutchins," Janet said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Officer Hutchins, you need to see this." "I need to see a lot of things," Hutchins replied dismissively, starting with proper respect for court authority. He still wasn't getting it. Even with the evidence scattered right in front of him, he was so locked into his assumptions about who Diana was and what she represented that he couldn't see what was actually happening. Diana finished gathering most of her papers and stood up fully. She could taste blood from her split lip, and her shoulder was definitely going to bruise where she'd hit the judge's bench. But her mind was clear now, focused on what needed to happen next. The door to Judge Martinez's chambers opened, and the judge stepped out, adjusting his robes as he prepared for the afternoon session. He was looking down at his notes and didn't immediately notice the tension in his courtroom. "Good afternoon, everyone," Judge Martinez said in his usual brisk tone. "I trust everyone had a pleasant lunch break and we're ready to proceed with..." His voice trailed off as he looked up and saw the scene in front of him. Diana standing near his bench with blood on her lip and her clothes disheveled. Hutchins hovering nearby with his chest puffed out in aggressive authority. Janet Morrison looking like she might faint. Papers scattered across the floor. The scattered remnants of what had clearly been a serious confrontation. "What in the world is going on in my courtroom?" Judge Martinez demanded. "Your Honor," Hutchins said quickly, "I had to subdue a disruptive individual who was trespassing in a restricted area and interfering with court operations." Diana almost laughed at the description. Subdue a disruptive individual. Is that what they were calling it when a bailiff assaulted someone for sitting quietly and taking notes? Is that so? Judge Martinez said, looking from Hutchins to Diana. His eyes lingered on her face, taking in the professional way she carried herself despite her disheveled appearance. Something in her posture, her bearing, didn't match Hutchins' description at all. "Your Honor," Diana said, her voice steady and clear, "I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding that can be cleared up very quickly if I'm allowed to show my identification. She's been trying to show some kind of fake ID all morning. Hutchins interrupted. Probably trying to impersonate someone important to get out of trouble. That comment made Judge Martinez's eyebrows rise. In his 20 years on the bench, he'd seen a lot of things, but people impersonating government officials in his courtroom wasn't one of them. It was such an odd and specific accusation that it made him more curious about what was really going on. "Ma'am," Judge Martinez said to Diana. "What is your name?" "Diana Thompson, Your Honor." The name didn't immediately register with the judge, but something about the way she said it, with quiet authority and complete confidence, made him pay closer attention. "And what brings you to my courtroom today, Ms. Thompson?" "I'm here on official business, Your Honor. If I could just show you my credentials." "Don't let her fool you, Judge," Hutchins interrupted again. "She's been acting suspicious all morning, taking notes about everyone, asking questions clearly up to no good." But Judge Martinez was starting to get a different picture of what might have happened here. He'd worked with Hutchins for several years, and while the bailiff was generally competent, the judge had noticed some troubling patterns in how he treated different people. There had been complaints, though nothing serious enough to warrant disciplinary action. Yet, "Officer Hutchins," Judge Martinez said firmly, "I'd like to hear Ms. Thompson's explanation before making any judgments." Janet Morrison, who had been standing paralyzed throughout this exchange, finally found her voice. "Your Honor," she said, her words coming out in a rush, "I think you really need to look at her identification. I think there's been a terrible mistake." The urgency in Janet's voice caught everyone's attention. Judge Martinez looked at his clerk with concern. "Janet, what do you see that has you so upset?" Janet pointed with a shaking finger at the papers Diana was holding. "Her ID, Your Honor, the seal, the official seal." Judge Martinez followed Janet's pointing finger and saw what she was referring to. Even from his position several feet away, he could make out the distinctive gold seal on the leather wallet Diana was clutching. "May I see that identification, please, Ms. Thompson?" he asked politely. Diana stepped forward, grateful that someone was finally willing to listen to reason. She handed Judge Martinez her official identification wallet, the one that clearly identified her as the Attorney General of the state of California. Judge Martinez opened the wallet, looked at the identification card, and his face went completely pale. "Oh my God," he breathed. He looked up at Diana, then down at the ID again, then back up at Diana. His hands were actually trembling as he held the wallet. "Officer Hutchins," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Do you know who this woman is?" Hutchins, still clinging to his version of events, shrugged dismissively. "Some troublemaker trying to cause problems in your courtroom, Judge. Don't let her con you with fake credentials." Judge Martinez held up the identification so Hutchins could see it clearly. The bailiff squinted at it from his position several feet away but couldn't make out the details. "This woman," Judge Martinez said slowly and clearly, "is Diana Thompson, the Attorney General of the state of California, the highest law enforcement official in this state, the person who oversees the entire justice system, including this courthouse." The words hit Hutchins like a physical blow. The blood drained from his face so quickly that Diana thought he might actually faint. That's impossible," he stammered. "She can't be. I mean, look at her." "Look at her what, Officer Hutchins?" Judge Martinez asked dangerously. Hutchins seemed to realize he was about to say something that would make his situation even worse, so he just stood there with his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The courtroom had filled up during the confrontation as people returned from lunch break. Word was spreading quickly through the hallways that something major was happening in Judge Martinez's courtroom. Lawyers, court staff, and members of the public were crowding in to see what was going on. Diana looked around at all the faces staring at her. Some showed shock and recognition as they realized who she was. Others showed embarrassment at having witnessed such a disgraceful scene. A few showed the kind of uncomfortable awareness that comes from seeing someone's prejudices exposed in the most public way possible. "Ms. Thompson," Judge Martinez said formally, "I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for what has happened in my courtroom today. This behavior is absolutely unacceptable and completely contrary to everything this court system is supposed to represent." Diana nodded graciously. though inside she was still processing the full impact of what had just occurred. She hadn't just been mistreated as an individual, she'd been assaulted while serving as the state's chief law enforcement officer, conducting official oversight of the justice system. The implications were staggering. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said quietly. "I appreciate your apology, though I hope you understand that this incident raises some serious questions about how this courthouse operates." Behind her, she could hear Hutchins breathing heavily, the reality of what he'd done finally sinking in. He'd just physically assaulted the Attorney General of California, in front of witnesses, in a courtroom full of people who would be talking about this incident for years to come. His career was over, and probably much more than just his career. The question now was what Diana would do with the power she held in this moment. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Diana could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, could sense the collective held breath of everyone waiting to see what would happen next. In her hand, she still held her official identification, the golden seal catching the light from the high windows. Officer Hutchins stood about 10 feet away, swaying slightly as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. His face had gone from pale to gray, and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the courthouse's air conditioning. The full reality of his actions was hitting him in waves. He'd just assaulted the highest law enforcement official in the state, based purely on racial assumptions and prejudice. Judge Martinez cleared his throat, clearly struggling with how to handle a situation that was far beyond anything in his judicial experience. "Ms. Thompson, what would you like me to do? Should I clear the courtroom? Should I call additional security?" Diana took a deep breath, feeling the ache in her shoulder where she'd hit the bench, tasting the metallic flavor of blood from her split lip. Every instinct told her to demand immediate arrests, to call for backup, to use the full power of her office to crush everyone who had allowed this to happen. But that wasn't why she'd come here today. "No, Your Honor," she said quietly. "I think it's important that everyone see how we handle this situation." She looked around the crowded courtroom, making eye contact with as many people as possible. She saw lawyers who would go back to their firms and tell this story, court staff who would spread word through the courthouse, members of the public who would talk to their families and communities about what they'd witnessed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Diana said, raising her voice so everyone could hear clearly, "what you've just witnessed is exactly why I'm here today. I came to this courthouse not as the Attorney General, but as an ordinary citizen to observe how our justice system treats people when no one important is watching." The crowd stirred, understanding dawning on many faces. She hadn't just been randomly victimized. This had been an official investigation. What I experienced in the last hour is what too many people experience every day in courthouses across our state. They're judged not by their actions, but by their appearance. They're treated not with the respect every citizen deserves, but with suspicion and hostility based on assumptions and prejudice. Diana walked closer to where Hutchins stood, though she kept a safe distance. The bailiff couldn't even look at her now, his eyes fixed on the floor like a child caught in a terrible mistake. "Officer Hutchins," she said, her voice firm, but not cruel. "You made assumptions about me the moment you saw me. You decided I was a troublemaker, a criminal, someone who didn't belong in your courtroom. And when I tried to show you who I really was, you escalated the situation to physical violence." Hutchins finally raised his eyes to meet hers, and she saw something there she hadn't expected. Not just fear or shame, but genuine confusion, as if he was seeing clearly for the first time how his own prejudices had blinded him. I thought," he started to say, then stopped, apparently realizing how any explanation would only make things worse. "You thought what?" Diana asked gently. "You thought that a black woman in your courtroom must be there for criminal reasons? You thought that someone who looked like me couldn't possibly have legitimate business in the areas where important people work?" The questions hung in the air like physical things. Diana could see people throughout the courtroom nodding, recognizing the ugly assumptions that had driven Hutchins' behavior. "Ms. Thompson," Judge Martinez interjected, "what Officer Hutchins did was assault. Criminal assault against a state official. The penalties for that are severe, and I'm prepared to hold him in contempt immediately and call for criminal charges." Diana held up a hand, asking for patience. "Your Honor, with respect, that's exactly the kind of thinking that got us here in the first place. Punishment without understanding. Consequences without learning. Justice without redemption." She turned, back to address the entire courtroom. "I could have Officer Hutchins arrested right now. I could demand his immediate termination. I could file federal civil rights charges. I have the power to destroy his career and probably his life." Hutchins was openly trembling now, and Diana almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But that wouldn't help the next person who walks into this courtroom looking like me. That wouldn't change the system that allowed this to happen. That wouldn't address the underlying prejudices that turn law enforcement officers into the very thing they're supposed to protect people from. She paused, organizing her thoughts. The decision she was about to make would affect not just Hutchins, but the entire courthouse, the justice system, and potentially thousands of people who would be treated better or worse based on what happened next. "Officer Hutchins," she said, "you're suspended from duty effective immediately, pending a full investigation. But instead of criminal charges, I'm offering you a choice." The bailiff looked up at her with desperate hope in his eyes. "You can face the criminal and civil penalties for assaulting a state official," Diana continued. "Or you can become part of the solution. You can undergo intensive bias training, work with community organizations, and help us develop new protocols to ensure that what happened here never happens again." The courtroom buzzed with surprised murmurs. This wasn't what anyone had expected. "Furthermore," Diana said, raising her voice over the crowd, "this incident is going to become the foundation for statewide courthouse reform. Every bailiff, every court officer, every judge in California is going to receive training on implicit bias and proper treatment of all citizens." Judge Martinez nodded vigorously. "Ms. Thompson, I want to be part of that effort. I've suspected there were problems in my courthouse, but I didn't know how serious they were. This can't happen again." "It won't happen again," Diana said firmly, "because we're going to create systems that make it impossible for personal prejudices to override professional duties." She turned to Janet Morrison, the court clerk who had witnessed everything. "Janet, I want you to head up a citizen oversight committee. People from the community will regularly observe courthouse operations just like I did today. But unlike me, they'll have official authority to document and report problems." Janet nodded enthusiastically, clearly eager to be part of positive change rather than just a witness to problems. Diana looked back at Hutchins, who was still processing her offer. "What's it going to be, officer? Are you going to be part of the problem or part of the solution?" "The solution," Hutchins said immediately, his voice hoarse with emotion. I want to make this right. I want to understand how I got it so wrong." "Understanding is just the beginning," Diana warned. "This is going to require real work, real change, real examination of beliefs and assumptions you might have carried your whole life." "I understand," Hutchins said, "and I'm grateful for the chance." Diana nodded, then addressed the entire courtroom one final time. "Let this be a lesson for everyone here. Justice isn't about punishment alone. It's about creating a system that works fairly for everyone, regardless of who they are or what they look like. It's about turning our mistakes into opportunities for growth and positive change." She gathered her papers, including the notes she'd taken during her morning of observation. Those notes would become part of a comprehensive report on courthouse reform that would be implemented across the state. "Your Honor," she said to Judge Martinez, "I'll be sending a team here next week to begin implementing new protocols. I trust you'll cooperate fully." "Absolutely," the judge replied. "This courthouse will become a model for how things should be done." As Diana prepared to leave, she noticed something she hadn't expected. Applause. It started with one of the lawyers in the back, then spread throughout the courtroom. People were applauding not just her handling of the situation, but her choice to prioritize healing over revenge, growth over punishment. But the real test wouldn't be the applause in this moment. It would be whether the changes she'd set in motion would actually protect the next person who walked into this courthouse. whether someone who didn't have the power of the Attorney General's office would be treated with the same dignity and respect that every citizen deserved. As she walked toward the courtroom exit, Diana caught sight of Hutchins one more time. He was still standing near the judge's bench, but something in his posture had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse and determination. Maybe people really could change. Maybe systems really could be reformed. Maybe one terrible incident could become the catalyst for something better. 3 months later, when Diana returned to the Riverside County Courthouse for an official visit, she barely recognized the place. The Citizen Oversight Committee was in full operation. New training protocols had been implemented. Most importantly, the atmosphere felt completely different, respectful, professional, fair to everyone who entered, and Officer Hutchins, after completing his bias training and community service, had become one of the most effective advocates for courthouse reform in the entire state. Sometimes, justice really was about redemption rather than punishment. Sometimes, the most powerful response to prejudice wasn't revenge, but the patient work of changing hearts and minds and